Welcome back to Inside Personal Growth. This is Greg Voisen, the host of Inside Personal Growth. And Stan, as I do every time I come on these shows, I have to thank these listeners because we're now at almost 14 years, 250,000 listeners. The list just keeps growing. And I thank them because they like the variety of the topics. They like what I put out and the genres that we put out. And today, from Salina, Kansas, we are going to be speaking with Stan Cox regarding his book, The Green New Deal and Beyond. And this book was recommended. Many of my listeners know Michael Johnson. So Michael Johnson has worked in helping the Land Institute get its name out there. And Stan is with the Land Institute. And we are going to let our listeners know, Stan, just a bit about you. He's the author of many books, including Losing Our Cool, Uncomfortable Truths About Our Air-Conditioned World. And I think maybe during the heat that you're having in Salina, Kansas, maybe got to have those fans blowing in the background. Any way you slice it, the past, the present, and the future of rationing and how the world breaks. Life in catastrophic in the catastrophic path from the Caribbean to Siberia. Stan has a PhD in plant genetics from Iowa State University. During his first career at the U.S. Department of Agriculture and now at Land Institute, he has authored more than 90 peer-reviewed scientific papers. His writings have appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, and many more publications. So Stan is not new to writing. He's not new as an author, and he certainly has done lots of research. And again, for my listeners, we will have a link on the blog to Stan's book, The Green New Deal. Please go out and get this if you at all have any interest on what's going on in our environment and what we need to do to curb, let's say, greenhouse gases. So, Stan, I think a great place for us to start is really to give the listeners an idea of what the Green New Deal is and how would this affect our environment positively if it was enacted. We live in a very strange administrative situation here with the current people in our government, which all of our listeners know. I don't know what the chances are between now and November of getting anything passed, but you have to be thinking long-term here. This has got to be a long-term deal.
That's right.
So tell our listeners a little more.
Well, the Green New Deal goes back in its U.S. version, goes back to 2 years ago during the 2018 campaign season. And it still is not really a plan yet. It's a vision. There are groups working on writing it up, but its roots go back 12 years now to the UK, where they had begun talking about a Green New Deal to get out of the Great Recession, to create jobs in building up renewable energy as a economic stimulus. And that's still a lot of what the Green New Deal vision, which all we have to go on really is a joint congressional resolution from last year that was submitted in the House and Senate, but has never been voted on. But what we might call the New Deal part of the Green New Deal, it has some very good aspects, like millions of jobs in building up green infrastructure, economic safety nets, healthcare guarantees, economic and racial justice. And all of those things are even more timely now, of course, as we're dealing with pandemic, economic collapse, and the persistence of racial injustice. It's the green part of the Green New Deal that is lacking, because it focuses on an industrial buildup of renewable energy, green infrastructure, but it lacks any mechanism to get fossil fuels out of the economy. And fossil fuels are so dug in this economy, they permeate it, that only a statutory cap on the quantities of oil, gas, and coal coming out of the ground and into the economy is going to get fossil fuels out. So in this cap has to lower, ratchet down year by year within, and get to zero within the next 15, maybe 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing in the Green New Deal that is going to do that. So that's the reason I wrote a book called Green New Deal and Beyond. That's the beyond part. The Green New Deal's fine, but we need this additional action.
Yeah, and I have a question for you that, we've seen in California here, the changes in legislation for electric cars and, but if these electric cars, and I think it was purported by a recent documentary I saw that 67% of our energy still, meaning electric energy, is coming from fossil fuel. I don't know if that number is right, but I mean, and I think electric cars is the way to go. But obviously, if we have electric cars and electric cars are using fossil fuels from plants that are burning to actually plug them in,
Yeah.
Where are we? I mean, I know that maybe sounds like a crazy question, but I guess unless there's solar panels on top of the cars or people are using solar in their homes to actually charge their cars, are we defeating the purpose?
Right. Yeah. Right now, driving electric cars it is not an emission-free way to drive. Now the Green New Dealers' vision is that we're going to rapidly build up enough renewable energy capacity that we can not only supply all of our current electricity needs, but that we can also junk all 250 million of our internal combustion engine vehicles and replace them with electric vehicles and build up enough renewable energy to power them too. And that is really going to make it a lot harder to replace, to produce enough renewable energy for all of that, because that's going to be a huge new burden on the electric grid. And
how much of our energy, Stan, is coming from hydroelectric, solar, wind energy? When you look at electricity in general, I was watching a documentary on Iceland, and in the 70s, Iceland was really dependent on fossil fuel. And from the 70s to today, they are not dependent at all. And I was just really, just surprised at the fact that their lack of dependence on fossil fuels, and everything there seems to be very green. Of course, they sit on a geothermal ideal condition to be able to get that energy from the volcanoes that are around there, and I should say the formation of the earth that's there. So where are we as a nation, meaning the U.S., in relation to the percentages being generated from non-polluting sources like that?
well, we're not as fortunate as Iceland is, having a very small, I think 300,000 population.
Yeah, exactly.
Sitting on loads of volcanic geothermal energy. But we're there. The past decade has seen the fastest increase in solar and wind energy, but it's still a very small part of the total energy supply, in the single digits. And we've always had hydroelectric and there's very little room to expand that further without causing a lot of ecological damage.
Yeah.
So it's really going to have to be solar and wind power that are going to have to increase. But even that fast increase in the amount of solar and wind that we've seen, it's big on a percentage basis each year, but it's starting from such a low base. But even that has more or less added to the total energy supply. It hasn't displaced fossil fuels. It
Hmm.
has been a recent reduction in the amount of coal-fired electricity, but that has been compensated primarily by increase in natural gas.
Hmm.
And so we're remaining very highly dependent on fossil fuels, and that's what we've got to do something about.
Well, you mentioned that our temperature today is 1.2 degrees Celsius higher than it was in pre-fossil fuel era.
Mm.
What are the effects going to be to our planet if we don't reverse these trends in the CO2 emissions and get this under control? Because, I personally, I know that continuing on the way we're continuing is not sustainable.
Mhm.
Um, and obviously it's going to have an effect to our crops. It's going to have effect to water supply. It's going to have effect
Mhm.
to everything that we're dependent on. So what does it look like if we continued where we're continuing?
Well, in October of 2018, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the thousands of scientists, it's the world's expert body on this, they really sent some shockwaves through the climate movement, and I think this spurred a lot of the enthusiasm for the Green New Deal. Also, when they issued a report that was simply titled 1.5 degrees of warming. So as you said, Greg, we're right now the Earth is 1.2 degrees warmer on average than it was at the beginning of the fossil fuel era, and so they're saying that we're running out of room fast, that we should not get above 1.5 degrees of warming. And then they went through a whole lot of projections of what would happen if we went, say, up to 2 degrees of warming, and then things really get ugly. We'd risk the irreversible loss of the massive Greenland and West Antarctica ice sheets. Some of the they're unbelievably large, would raise the sea level of the entire world by maybe 6 feet or more.
Wow,
We
that's
would,
pretty extensive. I mean, flooding in Florida and California would definitely happen. New
yeah,
York, you
yeah,
know,
it would be goodbye Miami for sure then.
yeah, yeah.
Um, and 1/4 to 1/2 of the Arctic permafrost would disappear, which would be particularly catastrophic because that would irreversibly release a new surge of carbon into the atmosphere, as that permafrost is a huge reservoir of carbon, and if it went into the atmosphere, it would accelerate the warming. Storms, wildfires, pest outbreaks would cause far more spread of forest dieback at 2 degrees of
Well, we're
warming.
already seeing much of this even in the state I live in, the fires that we've been
Oh,
having incessive, and um, the reality is that this is a part of that global warming effect. We're seeing
yeah.
aquifers underneath the Central Valley, now talking about the people that are growing almonds using up all that water. So we see a sinking valley as
Yeah.
well. So we're seeing lots of, what do we say, potentially catastrophic issues. And throughout this book, you provide an extensive history about how we arrived at where we are today. And in particular, you cite a book, Limits to Growth. And I went on Amazon and I looked that up. That original publication was in 72 from some MIT scientists. And those scientists wrote this book, and then it was revised again in 2004. So they did an updated version. I don't know if it was the same scientist, but I'm hoping that it was. So they revealed a world where we strip our resources. Speak about their predictions and why that book is really so relevant and so important to the story.
Well, this was a group that they started this work in 68. It was in the very early days of computer modeling, but yeah, MIT had pretty good models even back for those days. So they wanted to project the trajectory of humanity for the next 130 years. That is all the way up to the end of our current century. And so they, based on various assumptions about resource availability and how much economic activity we engage in, how much pollution we create and so forth, how long could economic growth go on? And so they were talking about a very long time frame, but they, as they ran these models, they got economic growth curves that went up just as they have gone up since then. And then, but whatever their assumptions, eventually, sometime before 2100, there was a very rapid decline. And sometimes it was because of pollution, including global warming. Sometimes it was resources running out. Sometimes it was that food production declined. And but in any one of these was what would, they said, bring about permanent economic decline. But finally, they said, okay, what if we alter the parameters of this model, and we assume universal access to birth control, limits on industrial production, dramatically increasing efficiency and durability of goods and so forth, and basically trying to live within ecological boundaries. And they found then you had kind of a modest kind of steady state economy. No, nobody's getting rich, but it could survive for the long term. And then around 2004, and they re-released that, but there were also others who looked at their models because they had been criticized for decades. They said, hey, what happened? The resources haven't run out. We're still having growth. You were way off on this. But when you looked at their curves up to 2004, their original projection said, yeah, we would still be on the upslope in 2004. And we were following that kind of business as usual model. The bad news is that those curves begin to descend rapidly in 2030. So even today in 2020, we're still riding that wave, but there are a lot of signs that it may not last much longer, and so that's why we have to immediately.
With those forecasts, Stan, do you have any belief that technological advancements that we're on the forefront of so many different things happening. The evolution of, just you look at the electric car. I heard Fisker out this morning now. They're back in the business again, and Tesla's stocks at all-time high. And we're just talking about one industry, but then you look at all these other industries, robotics and all this, where you're going to be able to do things much more efficiently. The question would be, did they try and put into their forecasts and those models all the technological advancements that could occur that could disrupt the potential effects that they were talking about on the decline of resources?
Well, that was interesting. They did do that, and so they assumed, they took different assumptions that there would be breakthroughs, unprecedented technological achievements that would get us past whatever the limit was, say food production, whatever. But what they said was that every time we a technological achievement got us past one hurdle to growth, the economy would resume growth up to a point, and then meet another obstacle.
I see.
So,
okay.
It's kind of like a whack-a-mole problem that you can't solve everything simultaneously.
Yeah. So in chapter 2 of your book, entitled "What the Hell Happened," you reference Margaret Solomon and Ariza Silk, the co-founders of the climate mobilization movement, as thinking their whole world has been shattered. And that's a statement I made. What was it that you believe has shattered the plans for change? And what are our hopes for continuing our movement in spite of what has happened? Because obviously in 2016, we had the election of Donald Trump. Everybody who knows anything knows what's happening with relation to his position. I have friends that worked at the EPA who no longer work there. I have people that are telling me the EPA has literally kind of just been on hold, that nothing's really getting done. We've seen 2 new people there, administrators. I think it's been 2. Who knows? It might even be 3. Before one guy gets going, the other guy comes back in again or whatever. What in your estimation politically is going on? And as you said in that chapter, what the hell happened?
Yeah, that chapter 2 is about the political events that starting in the summer of 2016 that led up to the development of the Green New Deal. And the context for Ezra and Margaret saying that is, I had asked them, is the opening scene in this chapter 2, I asked them, when do you remember, because I think a lot of us do, waking up on the morning of November 9th of 2016, the day after the election, do you remember what the first thoughts were that went through your head? And then that's when they talked about this feeling of utter hopelessness. And part of it was the 2016 leading up to that point had been a time of great optimism in the climate movement. They had, for example, gotten a very strong climate plank into the Democratic Party platform, mainly Sanders delegates getting it in there, calling for a World War II size mobilization for for dealing with climate and so forth. And there were lots of plans for the first 100 days of the incoming Clinton administration. All these things were going to happen. And so that's why they said, it appeared that everything had fallen apart. But then the movement kind of found its legs again before too long. And even with the interruption of the pandemic, there once again, not only the Green New Deal, but a lot of stuff is being planned for next year, because as you said, there's obviously nothing's going to happen legislatively this year.
No, no, no. But if we do see a change in administration, we obviously will see much more interest in, again, who's going to control the House and who's going to control the Senate. But with a Democratic president, I would think that we would see that. Now, you mentioned that getting fossil fuels out of our lives will not only be climate friendly, but will also end the environmental damage that has come with extracting and burning coal, crude oil, and gas. What advancements have been made in the percentage of electricity generated from that? I know you just mentioned to me that it's a small percentage, it's single digit. That surprised me because I thought it was quite a bit more than that, to be honest with you. I thought we were upwards of way more than that. So that was a big reveal to me. But where do you see this going? Let's say we do see a change in administration. We do see everybody come forward with the Green New Deal. How long would this take to see a precipitous decline in our dependence on fossil fuels?
Well, you're right, Greg, in that if hydroelectric is counted, then it's a higher percentage, but not for just wind and solar, and that's where the increase is going to have to come from. But there's the serious problem is an assumption, not just in the Green New Deal, but very broadly in the climate movement, that building up wind and solar capacity will kind of automatically through the market will displace joule for joule, you might say, the energy coming from fossil fuels. That renewable will be, because of being more desirable, and if it's going to be cheaper, then it'll chase fossil fuels out of the market. But history and research tell us that's not the case, that whenever new sources of energy come along, they tend to add to the total energy supply and not displace the previous ones. You think back to the late 19th century when oil production really started getting going, coal use continued to rise right through that period, and right in parallel with oil, and we just had a much bigger energy supply. And then natural gas after World War II really started increasing. Oil continued increasing alongside it, and that's because a growing economy and more energy is always very welcome. And so that's why we have to have a direct mechanism to reduce and eventually eliminate the extraction and burning of fossil fuels.
Let me ask you a little bit of an off-the-wall question. Since this pandemic started in March, we've seen a precipitous decline in air travel, use of cars, gasoline prices have plummeted, meaning the crude oil prices have plummeted. We have talks from these industries that people commuting to work is going to decrease precipitously, even if the pandemic ends or there's a vaccine. Do you believe that this pandemic that we're currently right in the middle of has had any effect? I mean, I know here in California, just from my observation, I see much bluer skies every day. I see freeways that are not empty, but they're certainly much emptier than they were before. So we don't see this burning of fossil fuels like we saw before. We saw a movement toward more electric cars. What if this lasts this way? Let's say it does stay this way, which would be a contraction, because it'd be hard for airline industries to only fly with half full planes. But My question, Yubi, could this have an effect?
It's funny. I finished the final edits on this book a couple of months before the pandemic came along, and in the book I briefly talk about what if, imagining scenarios, and one of them was, what if we organized a global boycott of air travel, people just refusing to fly, and air travel plummeted. And little did I know that 2 months later, 95% of flying wasn't, it had just stopped happening, and the world didn't end. We're all
We're all still here.
yeah.
We're now using Zoom, which is why Zoom stock's gone through the ceiling. But
Right.
the point is it's not as good as me sitting there interviewing you, but it's the second best thing.
Well, I think, and obviously this was a very chaotic, undesirable way to eliminate emissions, but it shows that a lot of our assumptions about what we have to have or have to do may not really be necessary. And I think especially in the debate about which businesses have to be open and which don't, and the discussion of which goods and services are essential and which are non-essential. I hope that will kind of seed a further discussion of that once we get outside of the pandemic, and we can decide what we can do without, or do with much less of, and and on the other hand, what are goods and services that everybody needs a sufficient quantity of, and to be sure that that is available, everybody has access to that, and that and to do that we reduce the production of what's not essential.
Very good point. And I think our listeners would like to know, they see that you wrote this book, The Green New Deal, right? But I'd like for you to tell them a little bit about the work that you do at the Land Institute, and why you believe that the Institute what they're doing is so important to transforming how our agricultural industry grows food perennially. Now, I know for me, I've recently learned that I'm gluten intolerant. Well, you're the guy with wheat, right? So in Salina, Kansas, they're growing plenty of wheat there. But yet I hear these stories about places like in Europe where they're still growing wheat, but that if I ate the European wheat, I know this sounds kind of silly, I probably wouldn't be gluten intolerant. Then I heard in the 60s, a guy got a Nobel Prize for actually crossbreeding wheat, so that, because we thought there was going to be a food shortage. And he goes out and he changes, I don't know what he did. He changed the seed. You're going to be able to tell us, so that these farmers could grow a lot more of it, but that it became a much different strain of wheat. Without telling us the whole history, what is it you're doing there, and why is this so important right now to farmers everywhere across the world?
Well, what we're doing is attempting to develop a whole new kind of agriculture, which would go way beyond growing certain varieties of wheat or corn hybrids rather than other ones. That Wes Jackson, who founded the Land Institute in the 1970s, I've been here since 2000, said at the beginning that we're always trying to work on problems in agriculture, when we really need to go after the problem of agriculture, meaning the growing of annual crops that require that every year the soil be disturbed, that the soil ecosystem be disrupted. We put new seeds in there, and then we do, at least these days, a lot of go to a lot of industrial efforts to keep it weed-free, insect-free, etc. Rather than having plants like, well, you know, like say like orchards that are self-sustaining. They grow every year. They're there for a long time, except they would be perennial plants that produce our staple grains and beans and oil seeds, which together those kind of foods are constitute 3/4 of our land area and our diet. So we're working on developing a perennial version of wheat that would grow back from the ground every year without planting new seeds. We're working on perennial sorghum. We have perennial legume, beans program. We are working with.
So you telling me you already have those?
Well, they're.
Do you have perennial wheat?
But in experimental strains of it, it's not ready for prime time yet. It's not grown in large production.
Right.
Yet. It's still experimental. Now we do have a perennial relative of wheat, which produces a small grain that it's like a miniature wheat kernel, can be used for much of what wheat is used for. That is called Kernza, and it is in pilot production in some commercial production on a small scale. And then perennial rice, which we worked with our colleagues in Southwest China on. It's now growing on thousands of acres in several provinces in China, and it produces as good a yield as annual rice in those places.
Wow, it's fascinating what you're doing, and just crazy. So to wrap up our interview, I think the listeners have gotten an idea of the Green New Deal. They understand that if we continue to grow at the current emission rates that we have, that it's going to be an issue. And how would you sum up for our listeners? How are they going to play an active role in the important issues as it relates to just the long-term survival of our species? You talked about MIT 2100, the economic impacts it would have. What can we do? I mean, I know you wrote the book about air conditioning, losing our cool. Obviously, the use of these instruments to cool us and the emissions that it puts out into the environment. Obviously, the amount of electricity that it uses, the consumption that it uses is tough. What would be your recommendations, just practical recommendations for the everyday person who has a huge interest in this, but would like to do something to curb the issue?
Well, as I discuss in the book, there are many ways that we all are going to have to be active, both as individuals in curbing our own consumption, but and also collectively to make the necessary change happen, and make sure that it happens very soon, because as the IPCC says, we've run out of time to steer our society to living within ecological boundaries. So our individual action and change in our lifestyle and so forth is obviously necessary, but we are not going to affect it solely through what we do individually. And one thing that we have to do, which we've been alluding to earlier, is to start demanding now that the candidates who are going to be on our ballots in November at all levels from local to national, that they're going to work for direct, rapid elimination of fossil fuels once they get into office. And then we all got to get out and vote in November, or in the primaries before November as well, because we really need the action at the higher levels of government has got to start as soon as possible, and we need to make sure that we have a president and two houses of Congress that can do that. And we need to raise the level of alarm to make people really believe that there's a climate emergency. And we need to create that sense of emergency. And I think maybe we can look at the recent Black Lives Matter actions that have been taking place this spring and summer as an inspiration for not just having a climate march, but to really turn up the heat.
If our listeners wanted to keep a pulse of the movement, besides reading your book, which I'm going to highly recommend here, that they get to go to City Lights, and we'll put a link to that. But if there was one website, maybe it's the Climate Change Initiative or whatever, what website and what newsletter would you recommend that they probably, so they can get their finger on the pulse, find out what's going on politically, what they can do to get involved, who they can support? Where is there one place where they can go that aggregates all that?
The one place that I always recommend is the climatemobilization.org.
Okay.
And we discussed its founders earlier, but they not only have do a lot of organizing. They were behind more than 1,000 either cities, counties, communities. More than 1,000 have declared climate emergencies now, and a lot of them are taking steps in response to that. But they also have the most comprehensive plan for what the government needs to do. They call it the Victory Plan because it's modeled on a plan that mobilized the economy during World War II. But it is very comprehensive about addressing not only climate, but all of our environmental and social problems. So that's theclimatemobilization.org.
We will put a link to theclimatemobilization.org. And Stan Cox, a pleasure having you on. Again, for all my listeners, go to Amazon. We'll have a link to Amazon to get this book. It gives you history. It tells you what's going on. It's an opportunity for you to learn. And as Stan just said, go to climatemobilization.org if you want to stay plugged into what's going on, which you should, because this is a very important thing we should all care about. Stan, it's a pleasure having you on Inside Personal Growth, speaking with my listeners worldwide, and hopefully all those listeners worldwide too, because this just is not an issue of the United States. This is an issue that's worldwide. For all of you listening at all those places, click on Amazon as well and get the Kindle version or get the version of the book. And thank you for all the work that you're doing at the Land Institute on perennial crops, because I do know that this is an important issue. I'd love to see, us be doing a lot more perennial farming. Hopefully the big corporate farmers are going to pay attention to what you're doing and maybe do something with it, because that's a huge industry, but I'm not certain their eyes and ears are always looking toward the future. It's usually how much profit is in it now. I hate to be a doomsayer, but that's kind of the way they work, isn't it? Yeah. So, but special greetings to you, Salina, Kansas. A great book, an opportunity for people to learn. Thanks, Stan.
Thank you so much, Greg.